She received a letter that morning, plain white envelope, no markings, no stamps. Saw her name in the corner. Dean Grant, attorney at law, was printed in clean, block letters in the upper left-hand corner. Her brother. Her own brother. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it already knew what was inside. She closed the door slowly and walked back to the kitchen, set the envelope down on the table, and sank into the chair across from it. She stared at it for a while. The kettle was still whistling behind her, growing louder, but she didn't move. Didn't blink. Finally, she opened it. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. This letter serves as formal notice that, as of May 1st, you are no longer authorized to occupy the residence located at 207 Ashwood Lane. Per Maine probate law and in the absence of a notarized will, the property is considered part of the Grant estate and subject to division among all surviving heirs. You are hereby requested to vacate the premises within 60 days of receipt of this notice. She stopped reading. Her fingers went numb. She had to put the letter down to keep from tearing it. Evicted. By her brother. From the house she had spent the last 8 years turning into a home again. She stared at the chipped teacup sitting on the table. A gift from her mother. Faint blue flowers curling around the rim. She traced them with one shaking finger, remembering her mother's soft voice, always warm, always a little hoarse, after her second stroke. You've earned this house, Evelyn. You're the only one who stayed. That was the truth. The cold, overlooked truth. When their mother fell ill, it wasn't Dean, Julia, or Miles who came running. It was Evelyn. She packed up her life, left her apartment in Bangor, gave up her job at the library, and moved back into her childhood home in Bar Harbor. She hadn't intended to stay. At first, it was just to help out for a few months while her mother adjusted after the stroke. But then came the second stroke and the broken hip after that. And slowly, just a few months turned into 8 years. 8 years of sponge baths and medications. Of dressing changes and emergency room visits. Of pureed meals and sleepless nights. She gave her mother everything. Not out of obligation, out of love. She stopped dating. Let her savings dwindle. Canceled trips. Lost touch with old friends. The world outside the house grew quiet, smaller, more distant. Her life, for nearly a decade, became centered around one person, her mother. And her siblings? Dean, the lawyer, called on birthdays sometimes. Julia sent pre-packaged gift baskets during the holidays with little cards signed, with love, as if a jar of gourmet jam could replace a visit. And Miles, well, Miles was a ghost. He breezed in for Thanksgiving once, stood awkwardly in the hallway, took a selfie with Mom, and left before dessert. They weren't there when her mother slipped into one of her coughing fits at 2 a.m. They weren't there when Evelyn found her mother crying quietly in the bathtub, too ashamed to ask for help. They weren't there when she passed, just Evelyn, holding her hand, whispering that it was okay to let go. And now Dean had the gall to serve her an eviction notice. Like she was a tenant. Like this house wasn't soaked in every ounce of love and labor she had to give. She reached for the letter again, but her hands refused to steady. The corners of her eyes burned. This wasn't just legal. This was personal. She had trusted them. Trusted her family to be decent, to understand. Her mother had promised this house would be hers. Not just in words, but in spirit. She had said it over and over again. I know they're not around. I know it all falls on you. But this house, it'll be yours one day. I told Dean that. I told Julia, too. They know. You've earned it, darling. Evelyn closed her eyes. Her mother's voice felt like a ghost inside her chest. She looked around the room, the same room where she had spoon-fed her mother oatmeal, where they'd watched the same black and white movies every Sunday. The same walls that still smelled like lemon cleaner and old fabric softener. She looked back down at the letter. No longer authorized to occupy. As if she were a stranger in her own story. As if love meant nothing. She sat there in silence. the letter in one hand, her other hand clutching the edge of the table, knuckles white, breath shallow. Not moving, not crying, just breaking, quietly, completely. Her fingers hovered over Dean's contact for a long time. She kept putting the phone down and picking it up again. She didn't know what she was going to say. She didn't know what she wanted to hear. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't sit in silence. Not after that letter. She tapped call. It rang twice. Dean Grant, he answered, voice clipped and professional. It's Evelyn. A pause. The switch in his voice was instant. Oh! Hey, Eve. I was actually meaning to call you. You sent me a letter, she said, her voice quiet, thin, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something inside her. Yeah, he exhaled. Listen, I know that's not how you wanted to hear it, but are you really kicking me out of the house, Dean? There was a beat of silence. I'm not kicking you out, Eve. The letter just explains the situation. It's legal stuff. Mom didn't leave a notarized will. The house is considered part of the estate, and legally it has to be split between all of us. Evelyn blinked hard, staring at the smudged edge of her placemat like it might anchor her. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. She told me it was mine. Dean, she told me over and over. I gave up my life for her. I know you did. And we all appreciate that. No, Evelyn interrupted. No, I don't think you do. I don't think you appreciate it at all. Because if you did, this letter wouldn't exist. It's not about appreciation, Eve. It's about what's legal. I was here when she couldn't remember what day it was. I was here when she forgot how to swallow. I changed her sheets at 3 a.m. I spoon-fed her oatmeal when she cried because her hands wouldn't work. I'm not arguing that, he said, but his voice was already getting colder. You were amazing. You did more than any of us could have. But the law doesn't care about who did more. It only cares about what's documented. And you just decided I should be the one left with nothing, she said. That all of that 8 years of my life was worth. What? A third of the sale price. He paused again. Then he said it. It's business. Evelyn laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound, like something scraped out of her throat. It's family, Dean. It's both, he said. Look, this isn't personal, okay? We're just trying to handle things properly. You'll get your share. She pressed the heel of her hand into her eyes, willing the tears to stay put. Do Julia and Miles know? She asked. Yes. How long have you all been talking about this? There was no answer. That silence told her everything. She whispered, You were already planning this at the funeral, weren't you? I wouldn't put it like that. But it's true. Look, he said, shifting tones, this isn't easy for any of us. It's a lot to manage. You didn't even stay for the service, Dean. You left before they lowered the casket. I had to catch a flight. You had to catch a flight. Unbelievable. She stared at the letter again, crumpled now at the corner where her grip had tightened. I gave her everything I had, she said, quieter this time. And I thought you'd understand that. I thought at the very least, you'd remember who actually stayed. Dean was silent for a moment. Then, his voice returned to its lawyer tone. We can talk again once things cool down. I've got a client waiting. Take care, Eve. Click. The line went dead. Her phone vibrated less than 5 minutes later. A text from Julia. Dean explained everything. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. No, hi. No, I'm sorry. No, are you okay? Just a command. Wrapped in courtesy. Evelyn stared at the screen, then locked the phone and set it down. She looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had made soup for their mother every evening for nearly a decade. The same one where she danced quietly by herself with the radio on when her mom was asleep. The same one where she'd tried to feel like a person, not just a caregiver. She got up and walked to the window. Rain had started again. Light, misty. The trees outside looked blurred, like a watercolor painting. They had all been planning this. Dean, Julia, probably even Miles, wherever he was. She'd assumed they were just distant, disconnected. She'd never imagined they were coordinating. But now, looking back, it all clicked. The funeral. That sterile, rushed little ceremony that didn't feel like her mother at all. Dean had handled the arrangements like he was running a meeting, kept things short, read from a card, didn't ask Evelyn if she wanted to speak. Julia barely stayed 24 hours. Wore all white for some reason and refused to go back to the house. Said it was too emotional. And Miles, she didn't even remember what he said. He'd shown up late and left early. Didn't say goodbye when he walked out. They weren't grieving. Not really. They were keeping things tidy. Waiting, watching, letting her mop up the grief and caretaking so they could sweep in later with contracts and market values. She turned from the window and went to the old bookshelf in the hallway. Pulled out the brown accordion file where her mother kept important documents, birth certificates, tax forms, insurance. She dropped it on the dining table and pulled it open, flipping page after page. Her eyes scanned receipts, letters from doctors, property tax statements, everything but what she needed. There had to be something. Her mother had said she wrote a will. "I left it all for you, Evelyn," she had whispered once. "They won't fight it. I told them already. I made it clear." But now Evelyn wasn't sure. She started opening every drawer in the desk. Rummaging. Papers flew to the floor. She wasn't even crying anymore. She was burning quietly, deeply, from the betrayal. From being treated like a placeholder. A helper. An afterthought. She didn't know what she was looking for. But she knew she wouldn't stop until she found it. The changes were small at first, almost too small to notice. Evelyn had always believed the house spoke in whispers. Floorboards that groaned when no one stepped on them. A hallway that creaked like it remembered footsteps long gone. But lately, the house had gone quiet in a different way. It didn't feel familiar. It felt watched. She first sensed it when the doorbell rang one afternoon, not with a friend's gentle knock or a neighbor's call, but a firm press that echoed like a demand. She opened the door and saw a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, khakis too sharp, holding a clipboard and a phone. The kind of man who always looked like he was between appointments. "Hi there. Evelyn, is it?" "Yes." He smiled like it was rehearsed. "Sorry to bother. Just wanted to see if the house is available for interior photos. The market's strong right now, and your brother mentioned we might be listing within the next 2 weeks." She stared at him. "Listing? For what?" "The property." A pause. Then she said carefully, "I didn't agree to list anything." The man frowned, looking down at his clipboard. "Dean Grant is one of the heirs, yes?" She stiffened. "Dean doesn't live here." "I do." He shifted. "Of course. I just assumed." "You assumed wrong." She didn't mean to snap, but the words left her mouth sharp and cold. "The house isn't listed. Not with you. Not with anyone." She closed the door before he could say another word. Then locked it. Top and bottom. She stood there in the entryway, her breath caught in her throat. They weren't waiting anymore. They were moving. 2 days later, she was trimming the hedges in the front yard, something she hadn't had the energy to do since early spring when her neighbor, Helen, walked up with her mail. "Got one of your envelopes by mistake," she said kindly. The postman was off again. "Thank you," Evelyn replied, taking the letter and tucking it under her arm. Helen lingered a moment. "Say, I saw your brother here the other morning." Evelyn blinked. "Dean?" "No, the younger one. The blonde one." "Miles, right?" Evelyn went still. "I wasn't home." Helen's face changed, a flicker of discomfort. "Well, I figured he had a key or something. He was walking around back. I thought maybe he was just checking on something for you." "He doesn't have a key," Evelyn said, slowly. Helen gave her a tight-lipped smile and nodded. "Well, maybe he left it under the mat." "I'm sure it's nothing." But Evelyn knew better. She barely slept that night. Her thoughts tangled in 100 questions. What was Miles doing there? How did he get inside? What had he touched? What was missing? She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She told herself not to. But the next morning, she went to the hall cabinet where she kept all the legal documents, the stack of bills, the folder with her mother's hospice records, and the envelope of insurance papers she hadn't opened since last winter. A few pages were gone. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. But she remembered filing them neatly, each one labeled, each one sealed. And now the folder had a slight bend, the pages out of order. The insurance form with her mother's signature was missing entirely. She closed the cabinet and backed away slowly. The house felt colder. She felt smaller, like she was no longer living alone, like someone had already started carving up her world in pieces without her consent. That night, Evelyn called Marla. It had been months since they'd spoken. Marla had been her mother's friend for years. They used to sit on the porch together drinking iced tea, talking about local politics and which bird feeders worked best against squirrels. Marla was also one of the few people who had still visited when her mother became bedridden. Evelyn's voice shook as she spoke into the phone. Do you remember if she ever said where she kept anything legal? Anything about the will? Marla didn't hesitate. I do. She said she wrote one. I was there when she signed it. Evelyn's breath caught. You saw her sign a will? She asked me to witness it. Said she didn't trust her kids to do what was right without something official. She said, and I remember this clearly, this house will go to Evelyn. It's hers. I wrote it down. I put it somewhere safe. Evelyn's knees gave a little. She sank into the kitchen chair. Somewhere safe, she repeated. Marla paused. Why? You didn't find it? No, Evelyn said quietly. I've looked everywhere. She didn't tell me where. Just said it wasn't where anyone could accidentally find it. They talked a little longer, mostly small memories. But the whole time, Evelyn's mind was already upstairs. The attic had always been a mystery. Dusty, creaky, full of old boxes and heavier air. But something about the words somewhere safe tugged at her chest. Somewhere that only she would think to check. She climbed the stairs slowly. Her knees ached more than usual. The wooden steps groaned beneath her weight, and the light from the small round window barely reached the corners of the room. She pulled the string on the old bulb overhead. It flickered, then glowed. She scanned the walls. The old desk against the far side hadn't been touched in years. She opened its drawers one by one, papers, a broken clock, envelopes yellowed with time. The bottom drawer stuck. She pulled harder. It slid open with a metallic grind. At the very back was a small compartment. A sliding panel, one she didn't remember. She reached in and opened it. There was a space just big enough to hold a book. Or a folder. It was empty. She stared into it for a long time. Then slowly, a terrible chill crawled up her spine. Someone had already found it. And taken what was inside. They didn't call. They didn't text. They just pulled into the driveway like they still owned a piece of my time. I saw their SUV through the front window, that glossy black one Dean always drove like it was an extension of his ego. He parked with precision, square with the edge of the grass, like the driveway was his client's office. Julia stepped out first, wearing that snow-colored blouse and pale beige slacks she always wore when she wanted to appear calm and in control. Her hair was swept into a bun, lipstick on. Too much perfume. She carried a brown leather folder like it was sacred scripture. Dean followed her, dressed in slate gray slacks and a pressed shirt, no tie. Behind them, a man I didn't recognize climbed out of the back seat, younger, dressed more casually, but carrying the same clipped posture. He looked like someone who'd practiced his smile in the mirror. I opened the door before they had the chance to knock. Well, I said, voice flat, this must be important. Hi, Evelyn, Julia said. She smiled, tight. This is Mark. He's here to help mediate the situation. Mediate? I repeated, eyes flicking to the man. Funny. I didn't know we were in a war. Dean spoke before Mark could. We thought it might help if we had someone neutral present. Someone who could help us all come to an agreement without. Without what? I cut in. Me getting emotional? Dean hesitated. Without misunderstanding. Mark stepped forward. Hi, Ms. Grant. I'm just here to keep things civil and smooth. Not here to take sides. I didn't answer. I stepped back and let them in, because I didn't want to argue on the porch with Helen from next door probably peeking out her window. They walked in like they'd never left. Their eyes scanned the walls, the furniture, the mantel. I watched Julia glance toward Mom's old chair, then immediately look away like it burned her to see it still in place. We sat at the dining table, the same table where I used to cut up my mother's pills and mix them into pudding so she wouldn't choke. Mark set a folder down and opened it. We understand this situation has been difficult for everyone, he began, looking at me like I was a delicate plate about to crack. And your siblings are prepared to offer you a fair solution. Dean leaned forward, lacing his fingers. We had the house appraised for $180,000. If we sell it, we split it 3 ways. You get 1/3, of course. But he glanced at Julia. We know moving can be hard. So we're offering to buy you out directly. He pushed a printed sheet toward me. We'll wire you $160,000 if you agree to vacate within 30 days. I didn't touch the paper. You've already appraised it? I said softly. Yes. So you've already decided it's not mine. Dean was quiet. Julia cleared her throat. Evelyn, no one is saying you didn't do a lot for Mom. But you don't own the house. Not legally. She told me it was mine, I said. You all heard her. But she didn't file a will, Dean replied. Not one that holds up in court. So yes, we had to start moving forward. I looked down at the paper. Numbers. Dead words. Typed with detachment. And what happens if I say no? Dean sighed. We'll have to go through the probate court. It'll be a mess. It'll take time. No one wants that. No, I said, you don't want that. Because then you won't get what you came here for in 30 days. Julia's voice lost its softness. You always acted like Mom owed you everything. I laughed, sharp, tired, real. She did owe me. And you know why? I looked right at her. Because I was the only one who showed up. Dean raised a hand. Let's not make this about who did more. Who did more? I interrupted. I wiped her. I sat up at night listening to her cry because her skin burned from the bed sores. I sold my car to pay for her prescriptions when insurance cut off. You want to talk about who did more? Julia's lips thinned. We didn't ask you to stay, Evelyn. No, I said. You just assumed I would. Because you knew I would. You counted on it. Mark stood, clearly sensing the room turning. I think this conversation needs a pause. Emotions are high, and understandably so. I stood too. Conversation's over. Dean gathered his folder without saying a word. Julia didn't look at me. They left as quickly as they came. I didn't walk them out. After the door shut behind them, I stood in the hallway listening. The silence after they left didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. Like a layer of something was missing, like something had been peeled away while I wasn't watching. I wandered into the study. One of the desk drawers was open. Only by a sliver, but I knew I hadn't left it that way. The folder of utility bills was out of order. My checkbook was no longer sitting square with the edge of the drawer. I checked the kitchen cabinet. The drawer where I kept my lockbox was slightly ajar. My mother's final tax return, the one with the real estate breakdown, was missing. Not misplaced. Gone. I didn't panic. I sat down. I breathed. Then I picked up my purse, my keys, and drove to the hardware store on Main Street. The guy behind the counter recommended a small indoor camera, motion sensor, Wi-Fi enabled, easy to hide. Cheap. That night, I plugged it in and pointed it straight at my bedroom door. I didn't tell anyone. But from that moment on, I slept with the door locked and the camera blinking red in the dark. It was nearly 1 a.m. when Evelyn sat in the quiet of her living room, knees wrapped in a blanket, her laptop open on the coffee table in front of her. The house was still. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like something was missing from the air. She clicked on the camera app, the one connected to the tiny black device she had installed by her bedroom door. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not even Marla. There hadn't been much to look at for days. A few flickers from hallway shadows, the motion of curtains swaying from open windows. Nothing significant. Until Tuesday. Tuesday afternoon, when she'd gone to the pharmacy to pick up a refill for her blood pressure meds. She had been gone for 42 minutes. That's when she saw him. Miles. He entered the hallway from the kitchen, glancing over his shoulder. No knock, no phone call. He moved casually, too casually, like someone who thought he belonged there. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner. Harsher in the face. Like a stranger wearing her brother's body. He went straight toward the study. The footage wasn't perfect, grainy, slightly tilted, but she saw it clearly. He opened the desk drawer, flipped through files quickly, then crouched near the cabinet by the floor. He tugged it open, rummaged through the folder with her mother's name on it, and pulled out a small white envelope. He held it in his hand for a long second, then slipped it into his jacket. Evelyn froze. She leaned in, pausing the video, replaying the moment. He had taken something. Something small, flat, folded carefully. Something her mother had likely touched, maybe sealed with her own hands. And then he left. No text, no message, no explanation. She closed the laptop slowly. Her fingers were ice cold. She didn't cry. She didn't even move for several minutes. Then she stood up, turned on the hallway light, and made her way to the attic. It had been years since she'd really dug around up there. The attic always smelled like dry wood and old blankets, filled with boxes that hadn't been opened since before her mother lost the ability to climb stairs. Light spilled from the single bulb overhead, casting long shadows over faded trunks and yellowed newspapers. She moved carefully, her hands dragging across the tops of boxes marked Christmas, Granddad's books, Mom, old clothes. She got on her knees, ignoring the creak in her joints, and began shifting things around. An old cedar trunk caught her eye. She had moved it dozens of times. It was always in the way, heavy, awkward. But tonight, something about it felt different. She pushed it aside. Underneath, one of the old wooden floorboards was slightly lifted, not loose exactly, but uneven, like it had been removed before and not pressed back in quite right. Her heart thumped. She reached for the corner and tugged gently. The board popped up with a dusty creak, revealing a narrow gap beneath. Inside was a small linen pouch, the kind her mother used to keep birthday cards in. It was soft with age, the corners frayed. She lifted it out carefully and turned it over in her hands. There it was. A white envelope. Her name written on the front in that slanted, looping cursive she hadn't seen in years. To Evelyn, in case they try to take what's yours. She dropped to her knees fully, the envelope pressed to her chest. Her throat closed. Her breath caught. For a moment, she just held it. As if touching it too quickly might cause it to vanish. As if this was all a dream, and she'd wake up any second back at the dining table with that awful letter from Dean in her lap. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a folded legal document, thick paper, stamped with an embossed seal. She read the words slowly, each one louder than the last inside her head. Last will and testament of Margaret Hill Grant. Signed, dated, notarized. And beneath the formalities, in black and white, I, Margaret Hill Grant, being of sound mind and body, declare that I leave my home and all physical contents at 207 Ashwood Lane to my daughter Evelyn May Grant, who has been my caregiver, confidant, and companion in my final years. This is my sole and final wish. Evelyn sat back against the attic wall, the will cradled in her lap like a lifeline. Tears came quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just hot, silent, and full of weight. She covered her mouth with one hand. I wasn't crazy, she whispered. She meant it. She meant it. Her chest heaved. All the months of doubt, of being treated like she'd made it up, like she was just squatting in someone else's legacy. They cracked open in one breath. Her mother had seen this coming, and she had prepared for it, not just with words, but with action. Proof. The truth. And now Evelyn had it in her hands. The next morning, Evelyn stood by the dining table, staring down at the manila folder like it might vanish if she blinked too long. Inside was the will. The real one. Signed. Stamped. Notarized. The one they said didn't exist. She'd barely slept the night before, not because she was anxious, but because something in her had finally cracked open. For weeks she'd been stumbling through fog, begging for clarity, begging for fairness. And now she had it. In ink. She zipped the folder into her tote bag, pulled on her old gray cardigan, and stepped outside. The morning was still cool, the air sharp. The old oak leaves scattered across the porch were damp with dew. Every step she took to the car felt firmer than the one before. The law office sat quietly on the corner of Oak and Maine. She'd passed it for years and never once stepped inside. Today, it felt like walking into a fight. Inside, everything was warm wood and still air. A receptionist offered her tea she didn't want. Evelyn waited in a quiet room with leather chairs and photos of proud lawyers in black robes shaking hands with local judges. And then, a door opened. Ms. Grant, the receptionist called gently. "Mr. Hawthorne is ready for you." Alan Hawthorne looked like a man who had seen every version of family betrayal known to Maine law. He had kind eyes, a bristly gray beard, and an office that smelled like lemon polish and old leather books. He stood when she entered and offered a handshake. "Let's see what you've got," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She opened her tote, pulled out the folder, and handed him the will with quiet hands. "I found it in the attic," she said. "My mother must have hidden it." He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning each paragraph with care. When he got to the signature and the notary's stamp, he gave a single, quiet nod. "Well," he said after a few minutes, "this is a proper will." Her breath caught. He looked up. Legally binding, clearly written, dated and signed, and it names you solely as the heir to the house and everything in it. Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest. "She told me," she whispered. "She told me for years that it would be mine. I didn't know where she'd kept it." "She must have known someone would try to challenge it," Alan said. "That's why she hid it. That's why she included the line about the others not having claim." Evelyn nodded. "They're already trying to evict me. Dean, my brother, sent me a letter through his firm." "I figured," Alan said. "Do you still have it?" She reached into her bag again and handed over the folded eviction notice. Alan read it, mouth tight, brow furrowing. This was premature, he said, and frankly unethical if they were aware there might be a will. They were planning to sell the house behind my back. They brought a realtor without telling me. Miles even broke in when I wasn't home. I have footage. He raised an eyebrow. "You do?" She nodded and handed him a small USB drive. "I installed a camera. After things started going missing." Alan plugged it into his laptop and watched the footage. They sat in silence as Miles appeared on screen, rifling through drawers, pocketing something, walking out like he had every right to be there. When the video ended, Alan leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, "this changes everything." He turned to his desk and began scribbling on a yellow legal pad. "We'll draft a formal response to your brother's letter. We'll file the will with probate court immediately. And we'll make it clear we're prepared to pursue legal action if they continue with threats or unauthorized access to the property." Evelyn swallowed hard. What if they fight back? They might, but they'll lose. He looked up. "Do you have anyone who can verify that your mother intended to leave the house to you?" "Anyone outside the family?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Marla West. My mom's old friend. She witnessed the signing. She told me herself." "Excellent," he said, pulling out a blank form. "I'll write up a witness affidavit." You just need to get her to sign and date it. Evelyn nodded. Her hands rested flat on the desk, steadier now. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone was finally listening. Believing. She spent another hour there, scanning the will, making certified copies, setting a timeline for response. Alan printed out a checklist for her: death certificate, proof of residence, copies of ID, tax records, property deeds. Everything the court would need. She left the office with a binder full of paper and a weight lifted off her shoulders. Back home, Evelyn didn't sit down. She moved from room to room, opening drawers, gathering every piece of her life she could find. Her passport, her birth certificate, utility bills addressed in her name. Her mother's death certificate, still folded neatly in the envelope from the funeral home. The deed to the house, which she'd found years ago and kept just in case. She had never imagined it would matter this much. She laid everything out on the dining table, stacked it, scanned it, labeled it with yellow sticky notes. Marla called just after noon. "I'm so glad you found it," she said. "Your mother would be so relieved." "I need your help," Evelyn said. "Can you sign something?" "Just confirming what you saw." "I'll be over in 10 minutes," Marla said without hesitation. When Evelyn hung up, she looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. This was her life. Her evidence. Her truth, no longer a memory, no longer something they could call emotional or subjective. It was real. Tangible. Bound in ink and law and dates and stamps. She stared at the signed will again. Her mother's name, still looping and neat even in her final years. "To my daughter Evelyn May Grant, who gave me her days and her dignity." Evelyn pressed her palm gently against the page. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel powerless. She felt ready. The letter went out on a Thursday morning. It was short, sharp, and formal, written on Hawthorne and Associates letterhead, and delivered to Dean's office via registered mail and email. It outlined everything clearly. A valid, notarized will had been found. Dated and signed. Margaret Hill Grant had named Evelyn May Grant as the sole heir to the property at 207 Ashwood Lane. Any prior attempts to evict her were unlawful. Any further threats of removal or unauthorized attempts to access the property would be met with legal action. Attached were certified copies of the will, Marla West's signed witness affidavit, and time-stamped video footage of Miles entering the home without permission. Evelyn sat by the window after her lawyer sent it, watching the early morning clouds shift over the tree-line. The house felt quieter that day, not empty, but settled. As if it too was waiting. She didn't hear anything for a full day. Then 2. Then 5. No call. No letter. No knock at the door. And then, out of nowhere, her phone buzzed. Julia. Evelyn stared at the name flashing on the screen. She let it ring once. Twice. She thought about letting it go to voicemail. But something in her said answer it. She picked up. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, just breathing, then Julia's voice, softer than Evelyn had ever heard it. "Evelyn, we didn't know." Evelyn said nothing. "I mean, about the will," Julia continued. "Dean said there wasn't one. If we had known, I swear we wouldn't have." "You wouldn't have what, Julia?" Evelyn asked calmly. "Changed the locks? Brought in a realtor? Offered me 30 days to leave the house I've lived in for a decade." Julia's voice faltered. "We thought it was what Mom wanted." "No," Evelyn said. "You thought it was what you could get away with." Another pause. Julia's breathing had gone shallow. "Dean's going to say it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Evelyn cut in. "It was a plan. A quiet, coordinated plan. You were already asking for the antique mirror in the guest room before the funeral was over." "Evelyn, come on." "I remember," she said. "Don't pretend I don't." Julia didn't respond right away. Then she murmured, I didn't know it would come to this." "It didn't come to this," Evelyn said. "You all brought it here." And with that, she ended the call. She didn't feel triumphant. Just steady. Later that afternoon, Alan called to confirm that they'd filed a formal motion with the probate court to block any attempt at listing or dividing the property. "No one can touch the house now," he said. "Not until the court recognizes your legal claim." Which, based on this documentation, they will. Evelyn thanked him and hung up the phone. She stood in the middle of the living room, the old wooden floor warm from the late sun, and looked around. The books were still on the shelf the way she'd arranged them. Her mother's shawl still hung over the back of the rocking chair. Nothing had moved, and for once, nothing felt at risk. The house had always felt like hers. Now, finally, the law agreed. Evelyn sat on the cold wooden bench at the front of the probate courtroom, her hands resting in her lap, clutching a soft tissue that had long since crumpled. The room smelled like floor polish and old paperwork. Somewhere behind her, the faint hum of the ceiling fan buzzed against the quiet murmurs of legal clerks shifting in their seats. Her lawyer, Alan, sat beside her, calm, collected, flipping through the prepared binder of documents they had spent weeks organizing. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, even though she didn't feel ready. Not really. Dean was across the aisle, seated in a tailored charcoal gray suit, legs crossed, jaw set like stone. He had always had that same calm mask, the one that didn't crack even when their father died. Julia sat stiffly beside him, in a pale lavender dress and flats that looked too expensive for the occasion. Her face looked pale, tired. The air between them was thick, not with grief, but tension, resentment, fear. Miles's chair was empty. No surprise. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat again. The clerk called out the case. Estate of Margaret Hill Grant. File 19 to 582. The judge, an older man with thinning hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose, looked up from the file on his desk. "All right," he said, flipping a page. "Let's get to it." Alan stood. "Your Honor, we are here to present a notarized last will and testament, signed by the deceased, Margaret Hill Grant, dated January 22nd, 2022, naming my client, her daughter, Evelyn Grant, as the sole heir to her estate, including the family home at 207 Ashwood Lane." He handed the file to the clerk. The judge skimmed the contents, flipping through the pages slowly. Dean rose from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may?" The judge gestured for him to speak. "Respectfully, we contest the validity of that will. Our mother had previously told me, and the rest of our family, that she had not finalized any legal documents before her passing. This will, which my sister found after we began probate discussions, raises questions." The judge didn't blink. "You're suggesting the will was fabricated?" "I'm saying it's suspicious," Dean said carefully. "There's no record of it until very recently, and Evelyn, understandably, given her emotional state, may have misinterpreted or misrepresented its origin." Evelyn stood. "I found it in the attic," she said, her voice clear but tight. "Under a floorboard. My mother told me for years that she'd written it. I believed her. And I found it exactly where she said she'd put something safe." The judge held up a hand. "Ms. Grant, thank you. Please let your attorney speak on your behalf moving forward." Alan stood again. "Your Honor, along with the will, we've submitted an affidavit from Marla West, a longtime friend of the deceased, who witnessed the signing. We also submitted a notarized statement from the notary public, who verified the signature. And," he added, lifting a folder, "we have video evidence showing Mr. Miles Grant unlawfully entering Ms. Evelyn Grant's home and removing what we now believe to be the original copy of that will." Dean's eyes snapped toward Alan, then back to Evelyn. "You had a camera?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't look away either. The judge reviewed the documents in silence. The only sounds in the room were the soft turning of pages and the shifting of Julia's shoes against the tile floor. After a long pause, the judge spoke again. "I see here that the signature has been independently verified against previous records. The notary's seal is valid, and the witness's statements are in order." Dean stood again. "Your Honor, I understand the emotions involved. This isn't about emotions, Mr. Grant, the judge said, finally looking up. This is about facts. And the facts show that your mother did prepare and execute a valid will. Julia let out a small, choking sound beside Dean. She reached for a tissue and turned away slightly, dabbing at the corner of her eye. Evelyn heard her whisper something, but couldn't make out the words. Dean's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. The court finds the will valid, the judge continued. We recognize Evelyn, May Grant, as the legal heir to the property and estate of Margaret Hill Grant. Any actions taken to sell, divide, or claim ownership of said property are to be ceased immediately. His gavel came down with a single, clean strike. Court is adjourned. Just like that, it was over. The clerks began to gather their paperwork. The room slowly filled with the sound of movement again, chairs creaking, heels tapping against the tile. Julia stood first. Her mascara had run slightly, and she avoided Evelyn's gaze as she whispered to Dean, "We shouldn't have pushed her." Dean didn't respond. He just stared down at the table. Alan leaned toward Evelyn. "That's it," he said quietly. "You did it." She nodded, but her throat felt tight. She hadn't cried. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't made a scene. She just stood up, smoothed the front of her coat, and gathered her things. As she turned to leave, she glanced once at Dean. He finally looked at her just for a second, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not power, just guilt. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She walked past them, past the pews and the people and the dusty flags in the corner of the room, and stepped out into the cold afternoon light. Her coat flapped softly in the breeze. Her purse felt lighter against her side. The sky above was wide and open, and the courthouse steps felt solid beneath her shoes. She didn't smile, but something in her spine straightened. Something that had been for years, under weight, under grief, under betrayal, finally began to rise again. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn walked away from something with nothing left to prove. The first thing Evelyn did was change the locks. Not because she was afraid they'd come back. She didn't think Dean or Julia would have the nerve, and Miles hadn't set foot in the courtroom, but because it felt necessary. Symbolic. Final. The old brass knobs, worn down by years of turning under her mother's hand, were replaced with new ones that clicked cleanly and closed with certainty. The locksmith had asked, "Lost your keys, ma'am?" "No," she'd replied, standing barefoot on the porch. "I just don't want the wrong people walking in anymore." He didn't ask further. Once the locks were changed, she moved on to the things she'd been avoiding. The guest room still held boxes Julia had stored there last summer, old scarves, a crystal vase Evelyn had never liked, and a framed photo of their mother from the 80s, untouched and slightly crooked. She packed it all carefully. She didn't toss it, didn't damage it. Just folded, wrapped, and sealed it into cardboard boxes. There was no note inside. No explanation. She simply labeled each one and dropped them at the shipping center down the street. The clerk asked where she wanted to send them. Evelyn slid the addresses across the counter without looking up. She came home and made tea. The house was quiet, not heavy quiet like it had been in the weeks after the funeral, but peaceful. Still, later that afternoon, she opened all the windows. The scent of pine drifted in from the backyard, and the curtains fluttered like they were stretching for the first time in years. She turned on the radio, not low like before, but loud enough to fill the kitchen. She cleaned out the pantry, finally threw away the expired cans of soup her mother had insisted on keeping, just in case. She swept the porch. She washed the throw pillows. She dusted the shelves no one had touched in years. She stood at the top of the hallway stairs with a paint roller in her hand, staring at the faded floral wallpaper she used to trace with her fingers as a child. That afternoon, she painted over it. A soft white. Clean. Bright. She moved slowly but steadily, brushing every corner, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and change. Marla showed up the next evening with a Tupperware container of homemade lentil soup and a paper bag of blueberry muffins. "I figured you hadn't had anything warm all day," she said, setting it on the counter. "You figured right." Marla looked around as Evelyn poured 2 cups of tea. Her eyes paused on the window, the new curtains, the sunlight that stretched all the way to the bookshelf without being blocked by drawn blinds. "It feels different," Marla said quietly. "It feels like your house again." Evelyn didn't say anything. She just smiled, handed her a mug, and sat down across from her. That weekend, she bought a spiral-bound notebook from the general store and started journaling. Just a few lines at first, scattered memories, strange dreams, bits of conversation she remembered having with her mother years ago. Some days she wrote only a single sentence. Some days she wrote 4 pages and forgot to eat lunch. Her hand cramped, but it felt good. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd heard her own voice not spoken aloud to others, but heard it, understood it, claimed it. A week later, she walked into the community center and signed up for a painting class. "I haven't held a brush since college," she told the woman at the registration desk. The woman laughed. "Then you're overdue." Evelyn went every Wednesday afternoon. The room smelled like acrylic and old coffee. Most of the others were women her age, widows, retirees, a few younger women with toddlers waiting in the daycare down the hall. They painted bowls of fruit and wildflowers, sometimes just color for the sake of color. Evelyn didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. It felt like recovery. It felt like something that belonged only to her. One morning, she woke up early. Too early for anything productive, but too late to fall back asleep. The sky was still dark, the edges beginning to gray. She stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders and sat on the porch, watching the quiet road in front of the house begin to glow. No cars. No footsteps. Just trees rustling and birds stretching their wings. She sipped her tea, closed her eyes, and let the breeze move across her face. And somewhere in that quiet, a thought came. They didn't just try to take my house. They tried to erase me. But I'm still here. The cold crept in slower now. Or maybe Evelyn had simply stopped noticing. The house stayed warm, even on the crispest mornings. Not just from the radiators she finally had serviced, or the tea kettle that now whistled daily like an old friend, but from the quiet comfort of knowing the home was hers. Fully, undeniably. No more threats. No more lawyers. No more knocking she wasn't expecting. Life didn't return to the way it was before. How could it? But something new had bloomed in its place. Softer, steadier. She had found her rhythm. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she walked to the local library, where the head librarian, a gentle man named Thomas, had practically begged her to run the senior reading hours. "The kids have their story time," he'd said. "Why not the grown-ups?" Evelyn had chuckled at that. Now she sat in the cozy back room twice a week, reading aloud from old novels to a circle of women with long memories and shaky hands. They asked her questions. About plots, about love stories, about how much of what we read we ever live. And then there were the memoir writing workshops at the senior center. They started small. 3 women and 1 man. But soon the room was full, people carrying half-finished notebooks, napkin scraps with poetry, dog-eared journals. At the first session, a woman named Clara had confessed, "I don't know how to write a whole story. I barely remember the details." "You don't need details," Evelyn said gently. "You just need truth." Clara had blinked at her. "And if the truth hurts? Then write it twice," Evelyn replied. Once to let it out and again to let it go. That was the kind of thing Evelyn said now. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had survived enough to know that the answers weren't what people needed most. It was permission. Permission to tell the story, even the messy parts. The house looked different now. She had repainted the study a soft sage green. The spare room was no longer filled with Julia's boxes, but held a desk, an easel, and a thick rug where she sometimes sat to journal with the windows open. She planted peonies in the front garden and bought herself a bird feeder shaped like a tiny teacup. Marla came by most Sundays with something warm and homemade. Sometimes they sat on the porch and watched the wind roll through the trees. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. But it was hers. It was mid-November when the letter came. A cold wind had stripped most of the trees bare, and Evelyn had just come in from raking the last of the golden leaves when she found the envelope wedged between the door and the frame. No return address. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Her heart didn't race. Not like it would have months ago. She turned it over. The handwriting was familiar. Neat. Precise. Controlled. Dean. She stood there for a long time, coat still on, leaf bits clinging to her boots. She didn't open it right away. She made tea first, washed her hands, lit the little candle on the kitchen counter shaped like a pumpkin. Then she sat in front of the fireplace, the letter still unopened in her lap. She stared at the envelope, running her finger over the edge. And then, slowly, she opened it. There were only a few lines. I hope you're happy. You got what you wanted. Family ties don't seem to mean much to you anymore. But I guess some people are fine ending things with paperwork and lawyers. No apology. No remorse. Just bitterness. Cold and small. She read it once, folded it back into the envelope, and stood. She walked to the fireplace, still glowing from the morning's kindling, and fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled quickly. It burned fast, like it had been waiting to disappear. Just as it blackened into ash, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text. From Marla. Soup tonight. Potato leek. Come hungry. Evelyn smiled. That night, after dinner, she sat on the porch with a blanket across her lap, a mug of warm cider in her hand. The sky above was deep and wide, stars just beginning to blink awake. The breeze brushed across her cheeks. No one drove by. No footsteps on the sidewalk. Just the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft creak of the old wooden swing beneath her. She thought about the past year. About the nights she slept in fear that someone would take what wasn't theirs. About the legal language, the betrayal, the silence that followed. About how people she once trusted twisted their version of love into possession. She thought about the attic. The will. Her mother's handwriting. She thought about the way truth had carried her through it all, quiet, heavy, waiting to be heard. She took a sip of her cider and whispered to the night, more to herself than anyone else. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the first to betray you. But you don't have to keep bleeding for them. You can stop. You can heal. You can choose yourself. The wind picked up slightly, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Inside, the house waited. Still warm. Still hers. Some wounds don't need to be reopened, they need to be left behind. And sometimes, choosing peace means walking away from those who never truly valued you. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories.